Who hates Iowa? We hate Iowa. Exactly. It's Battle of Floyd Rosedale week. It's Hate Iowa week. And every week is Hate Iowa week, but this week is especially Hate Iowa week. Today the goal is simple. We're going to preview the matchup between the Gophers and the nasty, stinky, dodgy, crappy looking Hawkeyes. And we're going to see what the chances are of the Gophers pulling off a win on Saturday. If you look recently at the Gophers' history, it's been the matchups will tell you that it's 2-8 in favor of Iowa the last 10 years. But last year the Gophers did win 12-10 on an invalid fair catch signal. That was the actual right call. And if you look at recent history, the score's been really close. Yes, Iowa has had our number, but it's not like they've been blowing us out the last few years. 2022 lost by 3. Year before that lost by 5. 2020 doesn't count because of COVID, and Gophers dealt with a lot of roster issues with COVID. And, year before that it was a 4-point game. I think, in 2018 you can say that was a legitimate blowout. 2017 was a 7-point loss. 2016 was a 7-point loss. 2015 was a 5-point loss. And 2014 was a blowout for the Gophers by, I can't do that quick of math. So, yes, the record is heavily in favor of the Iowa Hawkeyes, but if you look at the scores, it tells a different story. Each game has been within 7 points. So, overall, if you look at it, it's all relatively close. It's a very competitive rivalry. That being said, if we look at the teams this year, they are different than last year. Notably, that the Gophers have quarterback Max Brosmer, and the Iowa Hawkeyes this year will have Cade McNamara under center. Looking at the quarterbacks, it's interesting because if you look at the quarterbacks historically, it's a pretty big difference. Cade McNamara was a starter at Michigan. He led them to their first playoff appearance. He had some success there. Ultimately, they went with J.J. McCarthy, now the Vikings quarterback. But he's a solid Big Ten quarterback. Iowa, that was a good transfer get from Iowa. Last year he tore his ACL, so he didn't play in the Battle of Floyd Rosedale. We had Deacon Hill instead, who was an absolute disaster for Iowa. And in this year we have the Gophers have Max Brosmer, a FCS starter, super senior coming in to play Big Ten football for his final year in college. It's an interesting matchup, and to tell you the truth, despite the different paths that both McNamara and Brosmer took, to me, who has the advantage, I think quarterback is relatively equal. Yes, the Iowa Hawkeyes have, the Gophers, Brosmer's look good, and I think he has more talent than McNamara, but I don't think you can scoff at McNamara's record as far as, making the playoffs with Michigan, and, he's proven he can make the throws that he needs to make when the time counts, and to me, they're different. They're very similar quarterbacks play style wise. History, they're quite a bit different as far as resume and all that goes. But I think each of their skill sets and each of their abilities that they have, they match each other very well. And to me, the quarterback battle this week is gonna be pretty even between both the Gophers and Iowa. Moving forward to running back, I think if you would have asked a Minnesota fan this beginning of the year, it would have been clear that the Gophers have the advantage at running back. Darius Taylor is one of the premier running backs in the Big Ten, if not the entire FBS football. The thing is, though, running back Caleb Johnson for Iowa has really come on strong this year. He's looked great in the first 3 games of this year. He's not the most explosive guy, but he's a very hard runner. He gets the hard yards. He's going to get a lot of carries against the Gophers, I think, this upcoming game. And his stats are very similar to Taylor's. Yes, he has more yards, but Taylor didn't start a game. But if you look at average yards per carry, average yards per game, that kind of stuff, Caleb Johnson is very similar to Taylor. And if you look at their backup running backs, Major and their backup running back, whose name slips me at the moment, they're very similar. I think they both have about not 400 yards. They both have about 100, 200 yards rushing. They have a couple touchdowns each. Major does have a slight advantage in receiving stats, but their backup running back has a slight advantage in rushing stats. So I think overall, if you look at it, both the running backs are relatively equal. Now, if you look at receivers, it's a different story. I think receivers, you look at the Gophers, you have Daniel Jackson, Elijah Spencer, Christian Driver, and Nick Callerup at tight end, and Greer's at tight end as well. And the Gophers have developed a pretty solid receiving core, not to mention Lekeme Brockington. They have a very solid receiving core. Iowa doesn't really have that much this year. None of their receivers have gone off very well. None of them are, I don't think are uber talented. They're not very highly regarded. And so I think if you were to look at receivers, I think it's pretty clear the Gophers have the advantage there. I don't think it's particularly close either. So weapons-wise, I think you have to give the edge to the Gophers. It's probably the first year, too, in a long time that Iowa doesn't have, a tight end that's a threat. Last year, they didn't really either, but that's because Eric All got hurt. So I think, weapons-wise in the receiving room, in both tight ends and receivers, I think Gophers have the edge there. Now, the place where I think this spot here at the offensive line is going to be what could potentially decide the game. If the Gophers lose this game, it's going to be because of the offensive line, and it clearly goes to the Iowa Hawkeyes. Iowa Hawkeyes offensive line, I don't think it's historically good or anything. I don't think it's even crazy, above average for the Big Ten. But the Gophers offensive line has been very bad the last 3 weeks since the start of the season. And like I said in my post-game recap of the Nevada game, I don't know if it's a personnel thing. I don't know if it's a scheme thing or what's going on. But the Gophers offensive line has let up pressure to Rhode Island's defensive line and Nevada's defensive line, and not to mention North Carolina's defensive line. If we're letting up that kind of pressure to Rhode Island, Nevada, what is Iowa going to do to us? What is, looking forward down the road, Michigan, Penn State, all of that. And, against Nevada, there was a play where Brosmer clearly was getting hit a lot, and you could tell because he threw a pretty bad ball to Daniel Jackson in the end zone. He just got happy feet in the pocket. He felt like time was winding down, and he just ripped a ball through the end zone, even though he had plenty of time to make a better throw. And if Nevada's defensive line is doing that to Brosmer, it does make me concerned going into Big Ten play here, how big of a weakness our offensive line could be. And so if the Gophers do lose this game, I think a lot of it's going to hinge on poor play from the offensive line, which sucks because if anyone that knows football, it starts in the trenches. And, yes, we might have better receivers, and yes, our quarterback and running backs might be relatively even. But if that offensive line can't hold up, then it doesn't matter who's back there at quarterback or who's back there at running back. So to me, that's the big concern for the game going forward. Moving on to the defensive side of the ball, both these defenses have looked pretty good so far this year. They haven't let up a whole lot of points. I think Iowa, they're known for their defense, but it hasn't been the same Iowa defense in years past, if you get what I'm saying. Iowa's known recently for their extremely good defense. They're very good at takeaways. They're very good at scoring on the defensive side of the ball. This year, it hasn't been quite the same case as it's been years past, largely because they don't have, that game-breaking player on defense that they've had in years past. They don't have a Cooper DeJean this year. They don't have a Riley Moss. They don't have Kalen King. They don't have that type of, or is it Desmond King? Kalen King? Sorry, I'm blanking right now. But they don't have those type of dominant corners or defensive backs this year that just break games. They don't have a Jack Campbell. They just don't have that type of talent on defense this year. So I think defensively overall, both sides look very even. Though I will say this, on the defensive line side, if I had to choose, I would give the edge to the Iowa Hawkeyes. If you look at the sack numbers so far this year, and yes, those are kind of an arbitrary stat because we've all played different teams or whatever, but they've got 9 sacks this year strictly on the defensive line. They haven't had a whole lot of help from their defensive backs or linebackers. The Gophers, I believe, have 7 sacks this year, but they've gotten a lot of help from Jack Henderson and the linebacker core. And so for me, I think the Iowa defense line is ever so slightly better than the Minnesota Gophers defensive line. Looking at the linebacking core, I think, again, this goes to the Iowa Hawkeyes. It's similar premise of, they're very similar. I think Cody Lindenberg is great for the Gophers, but I'm not really the biggest fan of Maverick Brankowski. And the Iowa Hawkeyes, they have a couple guys that, are projected to get drafted, so I do give the slight edge, again, to Iowa Hawkeyes there. But again, we're talking, a half a point, maybe a point advantage in both those categories, so it's not a big advantage by any means. Defensive back, so it goes to the Gophers, and it's probably the first time in years it's gone to the Gophers. And that's not a knock on any of our history. I mean, we've had good defensive backs come through here. It's just Iowa's has had better. And I think it's the first year that you kind of start to see the Iowa's defense kind of stabilize or taper off just a little bit. And if you look, Gophers, we have the game-breaking play. We have, Jack Henderson has looked incredible so far this year. I wouldn't have predicted at the beginning of the year, but my goodness, he's like the Harrison Smith of the Gophers. He's flying around everywhere. He's making sacks. He's making plays on the field. He's had a pick six, multiple sacks. I mean, what more could you want in defensive back? He is like our game-breaking player this year. And, if the Gophers are going to win, it could be something from Jack Henderson. He could be like the X factor that like pushes the Gophers over the edge in this very, very even matchup of teams. Not to mention players like Kerry Brown, who got 2 picks last game. Corey Parrish, the new recruit's been looking pretty good in the play he's had. And Ethan Robinson's got a pick. I mean, compared to last year, this defensive back unit is so much better. And they could be the X factor that kind of tips it in our scale. So like if the offensive line tips in Iowa scale, the defensive back room for us kind of tips it back in our favor. And that also includes that Iowa has 2 safeties that are projected to go in the 2nd, 3rd round in the NFL draft. So, say we have the better defensive back room is pretty impressive. Moving on to our final category, the special teams. I think special teams are great when they can be game breaking, or if you have like a super reliable kicker that like a Justin, obviously it's college, but like a Justin Tucker kind of kicker that, really elevates the staff. But I don't think either team really has that. There's no Cooper DeJean again where there's like some dangerous returner for Iowa, and there's no, and on the Gophers side, like Dragon Kesich has taken a bit of a step back this year. He's been pretty inconsistent. And so, largely I think the special teams are pretty even, but again, like their kicker's been perfect. Our kicker's 5 for 9. Punters are about the same. Returners are about the same. Parrish hasn't established himself yet as a game-changing returner, which he could. He could against Iowa, but he just hasn't done that yet. And if I were to add 2 extra categories to this, I think I would add home field advantage and I would add coaching. Coaching, I'd give a slight advantage to Iowa. Good old Kirky down there he's been there for a long time. He's been very good for a long time. I mean, I'm not gonna, as much as I hate Iowa and as much as I despise Kirk, he's good. You gotta give credit where credit is due. And I think as good as PJ Fleck has done with us, his in-game coaching has always been under question. So I think you have to give the advantage of coaching Iowa. But I don't think it's a major advantage. It's not like, a Fleck versus Saban type advantage or a Fleck versus like, Sarkisian or whoever else you want to throw in there. Or like a Jim Harbaugh versus Fleck type advantage. But it is a slight advantage for Iowa. Home field advantage, it is going to help some. I think the Gophers, I think that's kind of what helps the coaching advantage a little bit, kind of evens that one out. Huntington Bank Stadium, I think, is one of the most underrated places that in all of college football. Underrated stadium atmosphere in all of college football. I've been there when it's been rocking, like the Penn State game in 2019 or the Ohio State game in 2021. I've also been there when it's been less than ideal, but it's going to be rocking for sure on Saturday night. It's going to be rock. Yes, we have quite a few Iowa fans there, but I think it's going to be mostly Gophers, and it's going to be a great atmosphere. I really wish I could go. It's going to be great weather. Everything's going to be great, but unfortunately I can't. Right now, Vegas has this game about a 2.5 advantage for the Iowa Hawkeyes, which I think is fair given their history with this game, the overall 2-8 record against the Gophers have had recently against them. But I think a lot of that has to do with more name recognition than actual talent. So for my pick, my prediction is that on Saturday night, on NBC, on primetime television, the Gophers and Iowa Hawkeyes will be tied with about 5 seconds left in the game. The Gophers will have marched the ball down all the way down to the 20-yard line. And it's going to be up to Dragon Kesich to hit a 40-yard field goal for the win. And for the first time in about a decade, the Gophers are going to win the Floyd of Rosedale at home. And the student section, everyone's going to rush the field. It's going to be a giant party celebrating the big rivalry win. Dinkytown is going to burn down. The Minnesota Golden Gophers are going to beat the Iowa Hawkeyes at home for the first time in about 10 years. And it's going to be great. It's going to be a great night, whether you're at home or at the game. It's going to be fantastic. I cannot wait to watch it. I'm going to be live streaming the game. From here, I'm going to start at about 6:15 if you want to join. It's a lot. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I really hope the Iowa game brings up a lot of people. I love chatting with people in the comments. I love just the engagement of it. So, if you want to join me at 6:15, if you want to watch the game with someone, I'm there for you. It's going to be great. I'm really excited to watch the game. I think it's going to be just a fantastic game overall. If you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe, comment. All of that engagement helps my channel out so much. Helps me get more impressions, helps me put it on the recommended page for YouTube, which is probably how you found this video in the first place. So if you want to help me out some, liking, subscribing is just huge for this type of industry. So Appreciate you watching. Roll the boat, Sky Ma, go Gophers, and I'll see you on Saturday night.